Welcome to the number one show and the source of truth for all things MedTech. Here, we reveal the secrets and stories behind the investments, science, and commercialization of the MedTech industry. Every week, we'll take you on a wild ride with the biggest names in the game, from entrepreneurs and investors who are shaking up the market to healthcare providers who are revolutionizing the way we think and practice medicine. So hold on tight and get ready for a journey like no other. This is the State of MedTech. Welcome back to the show, everybody. And today's solo pod topic is about managing oneself. I think the most important thing that I learned early in my career as a rep, as a manager, is the importance of understanding yourself and, more importantly, managing yourself so that you know where your strength, where your weaknesses, and how do you leverage those things. That's going to put you in the best position possible to leverage up into higher income earning opportunities, and more importantly, invest in the right skill sets that are going to open up the market to you. So that way you have great job mobility, options. And then even if you get to a point kind of like me where you say, I'm going to start my own company, right? All those things are options for you. I think that's the most important thing, is having options. Now, before we jump into it, a couple things I want to make sure to remind you of. Number one is we got Black Friday coming up. So I have a special discount for my Medical Sales Network Effects program, which is a course with videos and content in a private VIP group that teaches you how do you leverage digital channels like LinkedIn, like email, like video to sell and market to doctors. Now, the benefit about this, aside from making it better for you so you can grow your sales pipeline, be great at prospecting, is that this coincidentally also best positions you to be very attractive to other companies. The one thing I've noticed with a lot of reps who go through my program, especially the younger ones, who are like early in their career, is that because they brand themselves so well and they show how effective they are at communicating and selling to doctors online, companies see this because it's very public, and they say, man, what a great employee. Look at how they promote their product, their company. They have great leadership style. And then what often happens is that a lot of the people actually who go through my program, if not getting promoted, a lot of times they just get poached to another company and get paid a lot of money. So check that out. The other thing is, I think I'm going to go ahead and start a community for medical sales reps, because I think that there's a lot of ways that I can help you guys outside of just how to become a good rep. Many of you have asked me about questions about self-development. Some of you have asked about investing in startups, these kind of things. And so I want to make a community where we get to learn these things. I get to invite people from my network beyond just MedTech, people who in tech and investments and everything, so that you are able to plug in to develop yourself, get great job opportunities, and just learn, right? So if you're interested in this, I'm kind of doing a quick test. Click the show notes below. I have a form in there to fill out. Just give me your first name, email, and what you're looking for to get out of that kind of community. And then I'm going to decide whether I do this or not. I've already got a lot of requests from Instagram about this, so I'm likely going to do it, but I just wanted to make sure to just kind of poll and see what other interest in there. So let's jump into it. So first of all, I'm going to be kind of summarizing and going through this book, which is called Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is one of the greatest business consultants and minds in business, probably of all time. A lot of people say he's the greatest. And this book, Managing Oneself, is literally 55 pages long. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the intro to this, but then I want to get into some details and kind of talk you through this. So the intro says this. Let me open this up here for a second. History's great achievers, a Napoleon, Da Vinci, a Mozart, have always managed themselves. That, in large measure, is what makes them great achievers. But they are rare exceptions, so unusual both in their talents and their accomplishments as to be considered outside the boundaries of the ordinary human existence. Now, most of us, even those of us with modest endowments, will have to learn to manage ourselves. We will have to learn to develop ourselves. We will have to place ourselves where we can make the greatest contribution, and we will have to stay mentally alert and engaged during a 50-year working life, which means knowledge of knowing how and when to change the work we do. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so success, when you think about it, is success in the knowledge economy, which is really what we're in. If you think about why is Google $1 trillion company, they've started out and they still make 90%, I think, of their revenue through the organization and coordination of knowledge. So success in the knowledge economy comes to those who know themselves, right? And that means your strengths, your values, and how you best perform. Okay. So when you live in the age of unprecedented opportunity, i.e. the age of the internet, right, where technology's whole point is to reduce scarcity and create scale, right? You've got ambitions, you have a lot of intellect, right? So you can rise to the top of your chosen profession regardless of where you started out. I'm a great example of that. I do not have an MBA. I didn't study business in college and everything, but because of the position I put myself in, and again, understanding myself and knowing where to invest in terms of my time and effort in developing my knowledge base, right, is where I was able to stand out and grow in my career. So, but with opportunity comes responsibility. So companies today aren't managing their employees' careers, right? And I would tell you this all the time. Your career and your development is not the responsibility of your manager. Okay. Knowledge workers, which is that's what you are as a medical rep or a manager or anything else. That's really what you are as a knowledge worker. You have some knowledge and you're translating that to the market in the form of a service and a result. Okay. To be a true knowledge worker, you have to effectively be your own chief executive officer. Okay. So it's up to you to kind of carve out your place and to know when to change course and to keep yourself engaged and productive during a work life that, might span 50 plus years, as mentioned in the book, right? To do those things well, you need to start cultivating, right? And developing a deep understanding of yourself. And that doesn't mean just what your strengths and weaknesses are, but also, and this is a key point here, how do you learn? Okay. As I've always mentioned, and again, this is what the great Warren Buffett says, the more you learn, the more you earn, right? So how do you learn? How do you work with others, right? What are your values and where can you make the greatest contribution? So because only when you operate from the strengths and understanding those areas do you achieve real excellence. And in that process, you develop a brand of one and only. And when you have that, you have leverage, and that leverage gives you more money, more buying power, more attention, more access, so on and so forth. Okay. So when you think about this, right, you have to stay mentally alert and engaged in this entire process. Okay. Which is why I also advocate, and I started doing this 7-8 years ago when I wasn't making that much money, where I allocated, I believe at the time, 5% of my income every year to knowledge, books, courses, coaching, conferences that I paid for, right? Because I knew that no matter what kind of investment, like you can invest in the S&P 500, right, and get minimum a 10 to 12% return. Or as Alex Hormozi likes to say, you can invest in the S&Me 500. And when you invest in yourself, like you can get these outsized 10, 20, 30x returns. Okay. So let's start with the first one, which is what are your strengths? Okay. Most people think they know what they're actually good at. Okay. Usually you're wrong, right? And more often people know what they're not good at. Okay. So think about that for a second. You might think you know what you're good at. If you ask your manager, you might get a different answer. Okay. You definitely know what you're not good at. And even then, more people are actually wrong than right. Okay. Yet, you can, perform only from strength, right? If you think about it, right? Many of you know your strengths and know your weaknesses. Often you're wrong about those things, but you can only perform from your strengths. Okay. You cannot build performance on weakness, let alone on something you cannot do. Let me give you a great example of that. Okay. One of my areas of weakness is I'm not a spreadsheet guy. Okay. I've never had an interest, in like, developing formulas and numbers and all these different things. And so when it was advised to me that I should take a miniature course on learning the ins and out of Excel, I knew that was a waste of time because it's an area of weakness. And if you think about it, the key here is to figure out what are your key strengths and double down on those things. The same amount of effort I would have spent to go from a mediocre to kind of average person when it comes to running Excel, right, is the same amount of effort and energy and time I would have needed to take my top tier strength, what am I actually the best at, and get it to a point where I was world class. Okay. So one of those things was persuasion and sales. That was a smart thing for me to focus on. Okay. So throughout history, people had little need to know their strengths. Okay. And mainly this is from the Industrial Revolution. You didn't need to know your strengths. You just needed to sit in an assembly line and do your job. Okay. A person was born into a position and into a line of work. So a peasant's son, for example, would also be a peasant, an artisan's daughter, an artisan's wife, and so on. Right. But now you have choices. Right. For me, my father was a surgeon. At some point, I was going to become a doctor, but I decided to drop out. But you can change, right? You have these options and choices. So you need to know your strengths in order to know where you belong. And the only way to discover your strengths is through feedback analysis. Okay. Remember that term, feedback analysis. So whenever you make a key decision or take a key action, you got to write down what you expect to happen. And then 9 to 12 months later, compare the actual results to your expectations. This is something that Ray Dalio, the great investor, also talks a lot about, which is feedback analysis, right? I've been personally practicing this method for the last, close to 10 years, right? And every time I do it, I'm actually surprised because I think I know what I'm good at. I think I know what's going to happen. And then it turns out that I was wrong, right? And so the feedback analysis shows me, for instance, and to my great surprise, that I have an intuitive understanding, right, of certain things such as what makes people want to buy, what people are persuaded by, what are they interested in. It doesn't matter whether they're CEOs or investors, et cetera, right? But it also showed me that I can be wrong about certain offerings to the market, right? So this past year, I launched different offerings, okay? And some of the things that I thought were going to get traction did not, okay? So my point about this is that you often make decisions that are in the short term that have long-term implications. For example, for you to get a promotion, for you to focus on something, you need to be good about recording these things, right? And seeing, am I correct? Because the first key to true insight of yourself is to see, am I actually correct in my thinking, right? Because if you're not, that's something you need to fix, right? So you could, for me, I'll give you a great example as well for my career. I used to think that I understood what my bosses would wanted from me, okay? And then I started to actually record down certain things I would suggest or do, and then whether I was right about it. And eventually I learned, oh my God, I actually don't know what my bosses want, right? And just as another book recommendation, this is from somebody else, from John J. Gabaro and John P. Notter. That's how it led me to buying this book, Managing Your Boss, right? And so you only improve. Think about yourself as almost like you're like a living algorithm, right? The only way you improve algorithms is through feedback analysis and getting more data. So as a person, as a knowledge worker, as a rep, you have to call your shots and then objectively and in a disciplined way, audit yourself and say, was I actually right about that, right? And you need to be hard on yourself from now so the market, investors, your future bosses are not going to be hard on you. Because I guarantee you that in the future, as you get paid more money, the level expectation is higher. And so your level of discipline and execution is going to be really important. And so you need to be able to self-reflect and use that feedback analysis to not only improve yourself, but to say, oh, I'm actually not good at these things. Because whether you're in a manager or VP position, or in my case, you start your own company, then you know where to hire out and delegate things, not because you don't want to do it, but because somebody else is going to get it done much better and achieve the goal that you have set in front of you. Okay. So, and feedback analysis is by no means new. It was invented around the 14th century by a really obscure German theologian. And then it was picked up independently about 150 years later by a guy named John Calvin. okay, and Ignatius of Loyola, okay, each of whom incorporated it into the practice of their followers, right? So the idea of having focus on performance and results, that that is the actual habit of process that explains why institutions that these two men founded, right? It was the Calvinist church and then the Jesuit order, why they came to dominate Europe within 30 years, right? When you practice this feedback analysis consistently, the simple method, this very simple method is going to essentially show you within a very short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, where your true strengths lie. And this is the most important thing to know. Okay, the method will also show you what you're doing or failing to do that deprives you of the full benefits of your strengths. And it's going to also show you where you're not exactly competent on. Okay. And then finally, and this is also equally important, it's going to show you where you have actually no strengths and you cannot perform. This is important. The most important thing I think for your careers is to put yourself in a position where your strengths are going to be leveraged the majority of time, and those are going to be mapped to those goals, right? For example, I'll be open about this. Something that early in my career I suffered, where one of the strengths of being a great growth marketer is being able to be very organized and run experiments. Okay, by myself, I'm not good at that, right? And so early in my career, I had some really, really tough times, managing that. Okay. And I did not recognize that early on. That was a blind spot for me. Okay. Now, the next thing is actually working on improving your strengths. So analysis will rapidly show you where you need to improve your skills and acquire new ones. It'll also show you the gaps in your knowledge, and those essentially can be filled. Mathematicians are born, but not everybody knows how to do like advanced calculus and trigonometry, right? Third, discover where your intellectual arrogance is causing disabling ignorance and overcome it. Okay, a lot of you have this sense of arrogance when it comes to your knowledge, and you have to overcome that, right? There are way too many people, especially people with great expertise in one area, who think that their knowledge extends into other areas, and then they believe that being bright and sharp is an actual substitute for knowledge. Okay, this is the problem. This is one of the problems that I run through in my program, is that I get a lot of oftentimes CEOs who are really, really sharp and bright, and they mistake that sharpness and brightness for a way to overcome their ability to leverage, let's say, social media, right? And as a result, they don't become good students and they suffer, okay? First-rate engineers, for example, right, tend to take a lot of pride in not knowing anything about people, okay? Human beings, a lot of engineers believe, are much too disorganized and disorderly for a good engineering mind. But a human resource professional, by contrast, pride themselves when it comes to their ignorance of elementary accounting or quantitative methods altogether. But taking pride in such ignorance is actually self-defeating. Okay, so when you go to work on acquiring skills and knowledge, you need to fully realize your strengths. Okay. It's also really essential to get rid of your bad habits. So things you do or fail to do that inhibit your effectiveness and performance. Okay, so these sort of habits will really show up in your feedback analysis. So, for example, a planner might find that their beautiful plans fail because they don't follow through on them. And so many brilliant people have these great ideas, that they want to move mountains, right? But bulldozers move mountains, right? Ideas show where the bulldozers should go to work. And so as a planner, the planner has to learn that the work does not stop when the plan is completed. He has to find the people to carry out the plan and explain it to them, right? He has to adapt and change it as he puts it into action. And finally, he must decide when to stop pushing the plan. Again, a lot of times when it comes to CEOs and executive leaders, they really pride themselves on having a great plan. Having the plan and ideation around it is important. The other side of it is not just the obvious thing of executing it, but how do you recruit the right people, put them in the right places, make sure they execute it, adjust the plan. These things are other areas that people overlook, okay? The key takeaway here is comparing your expectations with your results also is going to indicate what not to do. Okay. We all have like a vast number of areas in which we have no talent and skill and little chance of becoming even mediocre. In those areas, a person, especially a knowledge worker, again, we keep using that term and for good reason, okay, should not take on work, jobs, or assignments related to that, right? One should waste as little time and effort as possible on improving areas of low competence. I told you this before, right? Do not waste your time there. And sometimes your manager is going to try and get you to do that. Figure out a way around that, okay? It takes far more energy and work to improve from an area of, again, low competence or where you're not good at to mediocrity than it does take to go from, let's say, a top performer to like world class, okay? But, and again, this is because of the industrialization of education. Most people, especially, and again, great example, like teachers and a lot of Fortune 500 companies, they concentrate on making incompetent performers into mediocre ones. Okay. Energy, resources, and time should go to making a competent person a smart performer. Okay. Great example with me. Okay. Earlier in my career, what I realized is that I'm very good at producing content. I'm great at speaking. I'm great at interviewing, right? And so I doubled down on the different channels and avenues for me to speak publicly at scale. Okay. That served me well because it literally built my entire business. Okay. Had I focused on other things, like I would have gone from like not so great to mediocre. And I'll tell you what, if you want to make real money in this world, being average is not enough, right? That's the big thing. So the next one is, how do you perform? Okay. A lot of people know how they get things done. Okay. Most of us, though, don't even know that different people work and perform differently. Okay. Too many people work in ways that are essentially not their ways, right? And that almost guarantees a non-performance. Okay. So for a knowledge worker, okay, you got to ask, how do I perform? And maybe an even more important questions are, what are my strengths? Okay, you really got to focus on that, because then that's going to guide you in your career in terms of the places you should work, the people you should work for. Great example for me is that I very quickly realized through this feedback analysis, I cannot work within a large organization like a Medtronic, a J&J, Drucker. It's not within my nature. I don't work well within those places. I work much better in the unstructured, fast-paced, high-intensity environment of a startup, right? That's just my thing, okay? Now, next thing you got to ask is that, are you a reader or are you a listener? Okay, this is really important because, first of all, it's very rare that somebody's both, okay? For me, I'm actually a little bit more of a reader. Sometimes I do prefer listening, okay, but I'm definitely more of a reader. And it's important to distinguish which one of those two are most relevant to you and you're best at, right? And let me walk you through a couple examples so you understand like why this is so important and how damaging it can be if you don't know this. Okay, so let's go back in history a little bit. If you look at Dwight Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower was the commander of the Allied forces in Europe, president, of course, and the press loved him. Okay, his press conferences were like very famous for their style. Okay, and so General Eisenhower, okay, showed total command of whatever question he was asked. Okay, and he was able to describe a situation and explain a policy in like 2 or 3 very polished, elegant sentences. Okay, 10 years later, though, the same journalists who had been his admirers held President Eisenhower in like serious contempt, right? And the reason why is he never addressed the questions they complained, but a lot of times he ended up rambling endlessly about something else. And they constantly ridiculed him for butchering, quote unquote, the King's English in very like incoherent and like terrible grammatically incorrect sentences. Okay. So Eisenhower apparently did not know that he was a leader. He was a reader, not a listener. Okay. When he was the supreme commander of Europe, his aides made sure that every question from the press was presented in writing at least half an hour before the conference was to begin, right? And then he was in total command. He read the question and was able to, to talk about it. When he became president, okay, he succeeded two listeners, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Both men knew themselves to be listeners, and they both enjoyed sort of a free-for-all press conference. Okay, Eisenhower, maybe he may have felt that he had to do what his predecessors did before, and as a result, he almost like didn't even hear the questions that the journalists asked, because if you're not a listener, a lot of times when somebody's asking the question, your mind sort of jumps off and starts thinking about something else to answer, right? And so understanding these things, again, like, am I a reader? Am I a listener? What's the environment that I best work in, right? And he's actually not an extreme example of a non-listener. So let's go a few years later, okay, in history. A few years later, Lyndon Johnson pretty much destroyed his presidency in large measure by essentially not knowing that he was a listener. His predecessor, John Kennedy, was a reader, and he assembled essentially a brilliant group of writers as his assistants to make sure that they wrote for him before discussing their memos in person. Okay, Johnson kept these people on his staff, okay, and they kept writing. He never apparently understood one word of what they wrote. Yet, as a senator, Johnson had been like really, really good, actually, right? So few listeners can be made or can make themselves into competent readers, and vice versa. So the listener who tries to be a reader will therefore suffer this fate that Lyndon and Johnson both had, whereas the reader who tries to be a listener will suffer the fate of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay, they will not perform or achieve. So really understanding this, especially I would say as you move into management positions, is important. So do you prefer to get briefings from your reps via email, or do you want to do it on a call, right? These things are really important. Now, how do you learn? Okay. The second thing to know about how you perform is to know how you learn. Many first-class writers, like Winston Churchill, is one, but not is one example, do actually poorly in school. Okay, they tend to remember their schooling pretty much like as torture, and yet few of their classmates remember it the same way. They may not have enjoyed the school very much, but the worst they suffered was boredom. Okay, the explanation is that writers do not, as a rule, learn by listening and reading. They learn by writing, okay? Because schools do not allow them to learn this way. They get poor grades. I'm kind of an example of that earlier in my career or earlier in my schooling. Schools everywhere are organized on the assumption that there's only one right way to learn, and that is the same way for everybody, right? But to be forced to learn the way school teaches is pretty much hell for students who want to learn differently. And there are probably half a dozen different ways to learn, right? So there are people who are like Churchill who like writing. Some people, take copious notes. Beethoven, for example, left behind an enormous number of sketchbooks, yet he said he never actually looked at them when he composed. And when he was asked why did he keep them, he reported that, well, if I don't write it down immediately, I forget it right away. If I put it in a sketchbook, I never forget it, and I never have to look at it again. I'm very similar in the sense that I write down a lot of notes. I don't go back and look at my notes. I just write it down for the act of it, right? Some people learn by hearing themselves talk, okay? There is a story of a CEO who converted a small and mediocre family business into a huge company in its industry, and was one of those people who learned by talking. He was like very much in the habit of calling his entire staff into his office once a week, then talking to them for a few hours. He would raise policy issues, argue 3 different positions on each one. He rarely asked his associates for comments or questions. He simply just needed an audience to hear himself talk. Okay. And that's how he learned. And although he is, this is kind of an extreme case, learning through talking is by no means an unusual method, right? Successful trial lawyers learn the same way. Believe it or not, Steve Jobs was similar to this. He used to have these Wednesday meetings with his marketing team for 3 hours, and he hated PowerPoint. He's like, I don't want to see PowerPoints. I want to hear people discuss and hash it out. So this is one way he learned, right? Of all the important pieces of self-knowledge, understanding how you learn is the easiest to acquire. When I ask people like, hey, look, how do you learn? Most of them know the answer. But when I ask them something like, do you act on this knowledge? Very few of them actually say yes, right? And yet acting on this knowledge is a key to performance, or rather not acting on this knowledge actually prevents you from getting the performance you want. Okay. So this is really important. Again, a lot of you guys, I'm going to use this example, have an issue of not knowing your cases and products inside and out. And all you're given a procedure guide, right? So some of you can read that. Well, for those who don't read that, There are plenty of apps out there that can translate that entire thing into an audio format so you can listen and learn, right? And so that's really important. Like, I'll give you another example. Some people actually work best as a subordinate, right? So General George Patton, he was a great American military hero of World War II, is a great example. Patton was America's top troop commander. Yet, when he was proposed for an independent command, General George Marshall, which was the U.S. Chief of Staff, probably the most successful picker of men in history, said, Patton is the best subordinate the American Army has ever produced, but he would be the worst commander. Some people work best as team members. Others work best alone. Some are exceptionally talented as coaches and mentors. Others just are terrible mentors. So understanding these things is going to be more important to you. And again, because of this process, I started learning about myself, and it took a period of 10 years. I'm still going through this. This is what led me to start my own business. I didn't just start my own business for fun. It's because I started to understand myself, my strengths and everything. And it led me down to the path and realization that I said, I need to just start my own business, right? And this is the reason why, a lot of times people fail is not understanding this, right? So important questions to ask yourself, other than how do you perform, is do you perform well under stress, or do you need a highly structured and predictable environment? And again, this is a great question for you reps, because some of you say, oh, I really want to go into startups. When in reality, many of you worked at Medtronic, Stryker, J&J. You were used to that environment. You like that environment. And so when you go to the unstructured environment of a startup where it is like fire, it's a fire drill every hour, you guys cannot perform under those conditions. And similarly, using myself as an example, if I were to go to a structured environment like Medtronic or Stryker, I would not perform that well in that environment, right? Asking, do you work best in a big organization or a small one? It's very rare for people to work well in all environments. Okay, there are some people who are great performers and do well in one or the other, but there's going to be one that you're going to be the best at, right? So the conclusion is worth me repeating. Do not try, and I want you to listen to this. Do not try and change yourself. You're very unlikely to succeed. Work hard to improve the way you actually perform. Do not try and take on work that you cannot perform or you will perform poorly on. Okay. So for example, a lot of you reps want to move into management and you see marketing as a shiny thing. Okay. The requirements of marketing for you to be successful may not be in line with how you are as a rep. Okay. And more importantly, how you are in line as a person. That's why I think a lot of organizations have terrible marketing, because they eventually promote some guy or gal who's like really great at sales, and eventually they move into the marketing position and it becomes a mess. Okay. Now, what are your values? Okay. To be able to manage yourself, you have to finally ask, what are my values? Okay. This is not I'm not asking about a question of ethics per se. Okay. And with respect to ethics, the rules are pretty much the same for everybody, and the test is a simple one. And you can call this the mirror test. Okay. In the early years of this century, the most highly respected diplomat of all the great powers was a German ambassador in London, and he was definitely destined for great things, which is to become his country's foreign prime minister and at least a chancellor. In 1906, he abruptly resigned rather than preside over a dinner given by diplomatic corps of Edward VII. Okay, the king was a notorious womanizer, and it made it clear what kind of dinner he wanted. The ambassador is reported to have said, "I refuse to see a pimp in the mirror in the morning when I shave." So that is the mirror test. Ethics requires you to ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to see in the mirror in the morning? What is the ethical behavior in one kind of organization or situation that is ethical behavior in another, right? Ethics is only part of the value system, especially an organization's value system. That's why when you go and interview at a place, you have to pretend like you got the job already and ask hard questions, right? Because if you have a problem with how they do business, guess what? You're not going to perform well, right? So to work in an organization whose value system is unacceptable or like incompatible with your own, right? It's going to make you frustrated, and more importantly, because this is the career episode, lead you to non-performance, right? So let's for example, think about the experience of a highly successful, like human resources exec, like somebody who's in HR, whose company was acquired by a bigger organization, okay, which happens all the time, okay. After the acquisition, this HR leader, okay, is promoted to do the kind of work that they do best, which includes, let's say, selecting people for important positions and coaching. This is the part that HR people love. HR people love looking internally and helping with promotions and mentoring and those kind of things. This HR exec deeply believed that a company should hire people for such positions from the outside only after exhausting all inside possibilities, which a lot of HR people believe that. Look internally first before you go outside. But her new company believed in looking outside first to bring in quote unquote fresh blood. Okay. And there's something to be said about both approaches. But again, my personal experience and my opinion, the proper one to do is a little bit of both, right? But starting internally, that's just my belief. Okay. But in this case, this HR leader and the company are fundamentally incompatible. Okay. When it comes to values, not policies. Okay. They see things differently. Okay. And sometimes, this happens within a company, and I'm not telling you to just because, your company wants to do something one way, you want to do another, it's that you have to leave. But if it's a value thing, you need to leave. It's never going to work out. Right. And so, value conflicts are not like limited to just business organization. Okay. One of the fastest growing churches in the United States, based, one of the fastest growing churches, which is measured by the number of parishioners. I don't want to mention the church. Its leadership believes that what matters is how many newcomers join the congregation. Okay, all right. And so, if you are a priest at this church and your belief is like strengthening the current congregation, but the church believes it's about bringing in new people, right? That's a conflict of values. Okay. And so a person's strengths and the way that a person performs rarely actually conflict. They're usually complementary. Okay. But there's sometimes a conflict between, let's say, your values and your strengths. And a lot of times it's because you're trying to adopt your company's values, right? And wedge yourself like it's like a square peg in a round hole. Okay. Something that you do very well, even like exceptionally well, may not fit with a value system. So again, I'm going to use myself as an example. Earlier in my career, there's a company I was at. There were certain things I was very, very great at. Didn't fit the company's value system. Wasn't something that they valued or cared about. And so in my eyes, I was like, I'm this great top performer. And then it finally clicked in my head where I'm like, oh, I'm in the wrong place. It's not that this is a bad or good company. This company is not a fit for me. I'm not a fit for a company. I ended up leaving that place to go somewhere better. Right. And so understanding this is really important. So that brings me to the question of, where do I belong? Okay. A small number of people know very early on where they belong. Okay. Some examples are like musicians, artists, physicists, right? Usually know where they belong by the time they're 5. Like they just know it. Okay. Physicians, right? Usually decide on becoming a physician, sometimes in their teens, right? But most people, especially highly gifted people, don't really know where they belong until they're way past their mid-20s. Okay. And by that time, they should know the answers to 3 very simple questions. What are my strengths? How do I perform? And what are my values? And then you decide where you belong. Okay. And so understanding those 3 questions, which I just walked you guys through, is going to be very important to figure out where do you belong? Because once you figure out where you belong, that's where you can flourish and thrive. And again, perform extremely well and make more money. Okay. And that starts, in my opinion, on figuring out where you do not belong. Okay. The person who has learned that they do not perform well, let's say in a big company, okay, should have learned to say no to a position in one. I've been approached, especially towards the end of my marketing career when I was employed, by large companies. And I always said no, because I knew that was not where I belonged. Okay. Right. And, another facet of this, knowing that you're not a great decision maker right, means that you should probably say no to roles where decision making is the most important thing. Okay. So for a lot of you who are like in sales position and everything, just because you have the opportunity to become a VP doesn't mean you should always take it, right? You're better off being a rep, a director, whatever it might be, and making really good money and developing a brand of excellence there versus going to a VP title just because it's a shiny thing and you get paid more. Because the mistake is maybe you take that role and you're not ready for it, or you're not that person and you fail. And so now let's say that entire 10-year span where you're President's Club winner, you know, all these things. Now you have a 1-year stint, 2-year stint as a VP and a failed one. And then those people often go and try to become a VP somewhere else. And, you know, they end up erasing all their great accolades and achievements because they're trying to become somebody that they're not. Okay. This took me a long time to understand this myself, you know, is that not everybody's fit to be a CEO. Not everybody's fit to be a VP. Okay. You know, and so that's really important. You know, the most successful careers are not planned often. Okay. They develop when people are prepared for opportunities because they know their strengths, their method of work, and their values. Knowing where you belong can transform an ordinary person, right, hardworking and let's say competent, but otherwise mediocre, into an outstanding performer. And it's such an exciting thing to see, especially in your career. When you understand who you are, again, what are my strengths? How do I best perform? And what are my values? And then you find where you belong, man, you know, and this happened to me, you go from like, let's say, a disgruntled employee who just for whatever reason isn't good at certain areas to being this outstanding performer. Okay. Now, a couple other areas I want to make sure that I address. Where should you contribute? Okay. So, or what should you contribute? I'm sorry. A lot of times people ask themselves what they should contribute, and those answers are often dictated by the work itself, right? And so there isn't exactly an easy answer to this, right? But the way that you get to that answer is through 3 specific questions. What does the situation require? Given my strengths and way of performing and my values, how can I make the greatest contribution to what needs to be done? And finally, what results have to be achieved to make a difference? The quality of your life is going to be reflected in the quality of questions you ask yourself. Okay. And I think that the same thing for your career. The quality of your career is going to be reflected in the quality of questions you ask yourself. Now, the last thing I want to cover is relationships, right? Relationships are very important, and very few people work by themselves and achieve results by themselves, right? Even great artists, scientists, etc. Like, look, Steve Jobs had Steve Wozniak, right? You know, Bill Gates had Paul Allen and Steve Ballmer, okay? So managing yourself also requires taking responsibility for relationships. And this has 2 parts, okay? The first is to accept the fact that other people are as much individuals as you are yourself, right? They insist to behave like human beings and do what's best for them. And this means that they also have strengths. They have their ways of getting things done. They have their values. And to be effective, you have to know the strengths, performance modes, and values of your coworkers. Even if you don't manage anybody, it's important to know this. Again, part of managing your boss is to understand, what is my boss really good at? What are they weak at? What are their values? What's important? Because then you know the answers to the test. Because the dumb thing is to think, oh, if I just do a really good job, my boss will like me. That's not always how it works, right? And so it's very typical for a person who has who trained to write reports in their assignments because their boss is a reader, right? But even if the next boss is a listener, this person goes on to keep writing reports. And I learned this the hard way because I had a boss that was a reader. I used to write memos to them. And then I had a boss who was a listener. And then I realized the smart thing is to actually ask these people, how do you prefer to get information? And asking the right questions will reveal some really interesting things. Where you manage somebody, you report to somebody, or anything else, right? You know, is to understand, like, hey, how do you prefer to receive information? How do you prefer to digest it? Do you prefer to talk it through? Do you want to get it ahead of time and talk? One of the CEOs I worked with, I realized hated hated being in meetings where I would present something, right? And they would get very restless. And then finally I just asked them like, hey, so-and-so, I won't mention their name. Do you prefer that I present this information like fresh at a meeting with you? Or do you want to get like sort of like an agenda ahead of time to know what we're going to be talking about and everything? And they told me, no, I prefer like to get a heads up ahead of time, because they wanted some time to think, right? And so that leads me to the second part of a relationship, which is the communication side. Okay. Whenever, let's say, myself or a consultant or anybody I work with start to work with a new company, right? The first thing they hear about are like personality conflicts. Like this happens all the time. Most of these actually arise from the fact that people do not know what other people are doing and how they do their work or the contribution they make, so on and so forth. And the reason they do not know this is because they have not asked, and therefore they've not been told, right? And so the failure here is to the failure to ask, just to simply ask these questions, right? Reflects like a very stupid part of being a human and human history, which is just ask these questions, right? And so my takeaway from this to you is never make these assumptions. Always ask these people, right? The more you start to understand people, and this is a key part of persuasion, the easier it is for you to ask the right questions and act in accordance with that, right? Same thing when it comes to selling, right? A lot of times you assume that a doctor wants to receive an email with all this information when many times they don't want that, right? And so asking these questions are very, very important, and it's going to simplify things in terms of the relationships you have, right? So just to kind of conclude and wrap things up, in a society where a lot of success has become like really important, right? That's like why you guys listen to this podcast, this is why we do what we do, right? Having options is really important, okay? It's not enough just to be great at your job. You want to have options. That's why I have people go through my program. They brand themselves on LinkedIn. That's the big differentiator, by the way, right? And so being able to do this is one of the most important things, right? And so knowing where you can contribute, knowing your strengths, knowing how you best perform, and knowing where you should not be are the key things that you have to start asking yourself, and really spending time reflecting, doing this feedback analysis. Look at your, up until this point, even if you just started your, you made some decisions, go back in your mind and memory and say like, was I correct, right? These decisions or these things, like, did they yield the results that I thought they were going to yield? And if not, why? That's the only way that you're actually going to get better. If you don't do this, you're going to go throughout your career working hard at the wrong things, not getting the money or promotions you think you deserve, and then becoming more and more a disgruntled employee. All of this starts by managing oneself and asking the right questions. Again, as I mentioned, the quality of your career, the quality of your life is going to be reflected in the questions that you ask yourself. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the solo pod. Think about it. Again, check the show notes below and click that link if you want to be part of this. I'm calling it a medical sales network. Click that link and just answer a couple of questions and give me your email. And then if I end up launching it, I'll give you early access to it. So with that being said, I hope you guys do well. Give the show 5 stars. If you benefited from this, please do me a favor. Send this podcast to a coworker of yours, right? Share this knowledge. Get better together. So with that being said, I'll see you all next time.
Thank you for enjoying another epic episode of the State of MedTech. If you're feeling inspired and love this episode, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss an episode. And be sure to give us 5 stars and write a short review, because that helps more people discover this amazing community of ours. If you're a company who has a executive that you'd like to be on the show, or perhaps you want to sponsor one of the episodes, shoot us an email at hello@khateebandco.com. Take care, and we'll see you next time.